Good morning, everybody. You know, I'm really kind of glad that you can't hear what the children say up here right before they leave. One of them said, Father, I got stitches in my back. And I thought, okay. I said, well, did it hurt? And they said, yeah. And then another one said, I had strep throat last week. And I thought, oh. And I said, are you better? Oh, yeah, I'm better. So we had this little dialogue, and then everybody you know is gone. Anyway, you listen to the gospel. The gospel today is kind of an interesting one, but it can cause a certain sense of uneasiness because it doesn't seem like it's really good news. Because Jesus is talking about murder. He's talking about adultery, and he says, I'm going to extend the understanding of those to encompass some things that are even bigger, that reside within the human heart. And for us to maybe begin to understand what Jesus is talking about, he only gives 3 examples: murder, adultery, and telling the truth. But in order to kind of understand that, we have to remember what he said at the beginning of the Sermon of the Mount. And the reason why is because that precedes everything that he says today. You remember, a couple of weeks ago, we had the Beatitudes, and Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the merciful, blessed are those who are clean of heart. And when Jesus said that, he presented an entirely new kind of existence, an entirely new way of thinking about the world, and a whole new way of thinking about reality. And in order for this to happen, Jesus said, you have to change your hearts. And we have a word for that. It's the word conversion. And essentially, as you listen to the Beatitudes, it's an invitation to change your heart and to begin to think of things in a whole new way, a new kind of existence. And Jesus realized that his words would be new and provocative, and that through the ages, there would be a lot of opposition to what he says in the Sermon on the Mount. With that being said, it's the scene for those 3 little sayings of Jesus is set by the first couple of sentences in the gospel. And Jesus said this, he says, I have come not to abolish the law, but I have come to fulfill the law. And then he says something like this. He says, unless your righteousness, unless your holiness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, anyway, who were these people that we call the Pharisees or the scribes? There you see a picture of them dressed in the traditional garb, the vestments of the Pharisees of the first century. Who was this group of people anyway? Well, they were the religious people of the time. They were the ones who kept the strict observance of the law. And they had the law completely memorized. You think, what do you mean by the commandments? The law, we have 10 commandments, and hopefully everybody at least one time or another memorized those 10 commandments. Well, the law of Moses had, get this, 613 rules. And the Pharisees had every single one of them memorized. You think to yourself, that in itself was no small project. So they were the ones who kept the law, and not only did they keep the law, they had the law memorized, but they kind of figured out it was their job to make sure that everybody else kept the law in the strictest sense. And so you could consider they were kind of what you'd call the religious police of their day. They kind of kept an eye on everybody to make sure that everybody followed the rule. You think to yourself, well, these seem like good people. They kept the commandments, they knew the rules, they kept the rules, and they also made sure that everybody else kept it. What's wrong with these people anyway? And when you hear, well, your holiness has to surpass that of them, you think, oh, the disciples must have thought, oh, we can't do that. We can't be that good. We can't be that righteous. We don't even know all 613 of the rules, let alone keep all of them. So why would Jesus be so critical of this group of people? And it has to do with the attitude that they brought to the law. They were strict legalists. They legally understood the law, and they kept it literally to the letter of the law. But there's something wrong with that. The reason why is they were so interested in the keeping of the commandments that they forgot the God who gave them the commandments. So those Pharisees, they were strict legalists. Something like this. Here'd be an example. Let's say that we had one of the Pharisees here in their uniform, and they said, "And tell us, Mr. Pharisee, according to the law, the Sabbath day is the Lord's day. It's the day that's dedicated to the Lord, and it's a day where there's supposed to be no unnecessary work. And so, Mr. Pharisee, you tell us, how many steps can I take on the Sabbath day without violating the law?" And the Pharisee would stand here and he'd go, "Well," he says, "I think you could take 125 steps on the Sabbath day without violating the law." And so I said, "You mean like 1, 2, 3, oh yeah, 25. And so I say, "Well, tell me, Mr. Pharisee here, what happens if I take, say, 126 steps?" And the Pharisee would say, "Oh, very bad. You have violated the law of God because you took one more step than the law provides." You think to yourself, well, that's kind of silly, isn't it? To think I could go 125 steps and it's okay, and I took another one and I was guilty of sin. So that's the kind of attitude that Jesus is talking about when he's talking about the Pharisees. Stop and consider this. What do you think motivated the Pharisees to be so strict and legalistic about keeping the law? What would motivate somebody to do that? Well, I'll tell you what the motivation was. They were motivated by fear. They were afraid of God, and they were afraid of punishment. And so they kept the law out of a sense of fear. Well, what is Jesus talking about then in the gospel today? Well, let's look at the first one. The first one is, "Thou shalt not kill." And if you notice the gospel, it follows kind of a format or a structure. And the structure that it follows is this. Jesus cites or gives the example of the commandment. He says, "You have heard it said that you shall not kill." But then there's an antithesis. Jesus says, "But here's my interpretation. You've heard that you should not kill. You shall not commit murder, or you'll be liable to judgment." He says, "But what I say to you is this: anybody who hates their brother, their sister, is liable to judgment." Jesus is beginning to kind of look at things in a whole different light. He's talking about something that's inside of us. Murder is an exterior thing, and it's an exterior action. But now Jesus is talking about the human heart, hatred. Let's look at the next one. Same format. He says, "You have heard it said to your ancestors that you shall not commit adultery." And he says, "But this is what I say to you." He says, "What I say to you is this: a person who lusts after another person in their heart has already committed adultery with her." Adultery, an exterior action. Lust is a movement of the heart. You look at the last one. Jesus said, "You shall not take a false oath, but be faithful to the promises that you make. But what I say to you is this: say yes when you mean yes. If you don't intend to do it, then say no and mean no." So in other words, an oath, like you do in court, swear, tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. That's an exterior action, and Jesus is talking about a promise, which is a movement of the heart. If the Pharisees are motivated by fear to keep the commandments, fear of God and fear of punishment, what is Jesus talking about, the motivation here? Well, when he's talking about the heart, we got Valentine's Day here in a couple of days. When he's talking about the heart, what he's talking about is keeping the commandments, not out of a sense of fear and retribution, but obeying the commandments of God because we love. Because we love. Love is at the heart of God's kingdom. We keep the commandments because we love. We love God, first of all, and we love one another. Okay, it's kind of like this. The difference between a thermometer and a thermostat. Okay, y'all familiar with a thermometer? You know, you don't feel so good, you go to the doctor. Suppose the little kid with a strep throat, oh gee, I hope they went to the doctor. Anyway, you go to the doctor, and one of the first things they do is they take your pulse to make sure you're still alive, and they take your blood pressure to make sure that that's okay, and then they take your temperature. Sometimes they do a thing in your mouth. They got new kinds of devices where they put it on your head, and you put it in your ears, and they'll tell you what the temperature is. So actually, the thermometer is telling the doctor about something that's happening inside of you. And if your temperature is 98.6, then it's probably you don't have some kind of an infection. You go in there and you say, you know, I just feel awful, awful, awful. They take your temperature, and it's like 101.4. The doctor thinks, oh, you probably got an infection somewhere. So we maybe better give you an antibiotic. So a thermometer tells you what's happening inside of you. Our spiritual thermometer tells us about something that's happening inside of our heart in a spiritual way. Let's look at a thermostat. Probably everybody's got thermostats in their house. Interesting about a thermostat is it tells you what is happening on the exterior, outside of you. And the interesting about a thermostat, you can change the temperature. You can, with 72, I can bring it down to 68, and it'll cool my house down. A thermometer can't do that. It cannot change your body temperature. It just tells you what the temperature is inside. Unlike a thermostat, which is an exterior kind of a thing, and it tells you what the temperature is outside of you, and it can adjust it up or down. Jesus is talking about what's inside of us. He's talking about, in some sense, a spiritual thermometer. I'm going to give you a gospel challenge, a challenge for this week. It's really simple. It's going to only be one thing. Now, you heard in the first reading from the book of Sirach. In the book of Sirach, it says that God has given us this wonderful gift. It's the gift of free choice. We can choose. We can choose fire or water. We can choose life or death, or we can choose good or evil. One of the things about choices is that it's like a thermometer. A choice reveals what's in your heart. So here's the challenge, the gospel challenge for this week. Sometime this week, take about 5 minutes or so, find a quiet place, and when you find that quiet place, take a couple of deep breaths, and then say, Jesus, come into my heart. Jesus, come into my heart. Jesus, come into my spirit. And then look at one choice, one decision that you made recently. And when you look at that one choice or that one decision that you made recently, ask yourself this question. What does that decision or choice mean? What does it tell me about what's in my heart? It's like a thermometer. It'll tell you kind of what's happening in your heart. You know, unfortunately, we can't change the decisions and the choices that we make. But the good news is this, we can learn from them. So this week, that's the gospel challenge. Think about a choice that you made and ask Jesus to help you see, that's like a spiritual thermometer, what's happening inside of you. The Beatitudes are remarkable. They've stood the test of time because in those Beatitudes, Jesus says, I want to tell you about a new way of doing that maybe you never even thought about, but I want to tell you about a new way of thinking, a new kind of existence. And when you really get down to it, the Beatitudes are a powerful invitation to holiness. And you know, as disciples of the Lord, all of us are called to be holy. And the good news is this. God says, I am holiness itself. And in turn now, I'm inviting you to walk with me in holiness.